Hey everyone, if you love scary stories, hit that subscribe button and join the creepy crew. Also, don't forget to like a video and tell me in the comments what time are you watching this now. Story 1. The Whispers of Blackwater Ridge. I never imagined that the mountains could speak, that the silent slopes and forgotten valleys of Appalachia would one day reveal their hidden voices. I arrived at Blackwater Ridge on a chilly autumn afternoon, when the sky was a tapestry of muted grays and the air carried the scent of pine and damp earth. The ridge, a steep escarpment overlooking a deep valley shrouded in mist, had long been the subject of local legenda place, where the past and the present blurred into an endless twilight. I had come seeking solitude to escape the relentless clamor of modern life, but I soon discovered that the ridge was not as empty as it appeared. The old cabin I rented stood on the very edge of the ridge, its weathered wood and sagging porch bearing the marks of many winters. Locals spoke of the cabin in hushed tones, saying that on nights when the wind howled just right, voices could be heard drifting down from the mountain. At first, I dismissed these stories as mere superstition, the product of isolation and an overactive imagination. But on my first night there, as the sky turned dark and the stars emerged like scattered diamonds, I began to hear something unusual, a soft, rhythmic knocking coming from the walls. It was not the sound of wind against the old boards, but a deliberate, measured pulse that seemed to beckon me to listen. I spent that night wide awake, my mind churning with questions. Each creak and groan of the old house only added to the mounting sense of foreboding. In the early hours before dawn, I crept outside onto the creaking porch, drawn by the sound. The ridge below was cloaked in a dense fog that obscured the valley, and as I listened, I realized that the sound was not random at all. It followed a paterna series of 3 short knocks, a pause, and then 3 long ones. I recalled an old local rhyme that spoke of the voices of the ridge, but I had never taken it seriously until that moment. The sound, echoing across the vast emptiness, made my blood run cold. The following day, I explored the ridge on foot. The trail wound through ancient forests and over rocky outcroppings, and every step seemed to stir memories of old tragedies buried in the earth. I came upon a small clearing where a weathered stone marker stood. The inscription was barely legible, worn away by time, yet I could make out the name Eleanor and a date from a century ago. A chill passed through me as I wondered if this might be one of the voicey echo of a life lost on these unforgiving slopes. That night, I set up my camp on a flat ridge overlooking the valley. The air was clear, and the full moon bathed everything in a silver light that made the darkness even more profound. I sat by my small fire and listened as the sound of the knocks resumed, now accompanied by a low, sorrowful whisper that seemed to rise from the valley itself. I strained to make out the words, but they were lost in the wind. In the days that followed, the experience grew even more unnerving. I began to notice shadowy figures flitting along the edge of my Visona flash of movement among the trees, a face peering out from behind a rock, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. One evening, while I was reading in the cabin, I saw in the mirror a figure standing behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there except the reflection of the old creaking room. Yet the sense of being watched never left me. I started keeping a journal, recording every sound, every strange occurrence, every detail of the unnatural events that had begun to define my nights. The journal filled with frantic entries, descriptions of voices that sounded both human and inhuman, accounts of objects moving on their own, and, most disturbingly, the recurring pattern of knocking and whispering. I sought out the local residents for answers. At a small general store in the nearest town, I met an old man who had lived near the ridge all his life. His eyes, clouded with memories, told stories of a time when the land was alive with sorrow. "Blackwater Ridge isn't just a place, son," he rasped, leaning in close as if to share a secret. "It's a living memory. The voices you hear are the echoes of those who never left. They're trapped in the stone and the trees and the very air you breathe. And sometimes, when the night is ripe, they reach out for the living." I listened in silence, both skeptical and terrified. The weight of his words settling over me like a shroud. Determined to understand the mystery, I began to study local records and old newspapers. I learned that many decades ago, a young woman named Eleanor had vanished on the ridge under mysterious circumstances. Some said she had been the victim of a tragic accident. Others whispered of foul play, of a lover's betrayal that had driven her to despair. Her name, inscribed on a marker in the clearing, seemed to pulse with a life of its own as I pieced together fragments of her story. I began to suspect that her restless spirit, along with those of others lost on these mountains, was calling out to me through the knocks and whispers. The more I delved into the history of Blackwater Ridge, the more I became convinced that the land itself was steeped in grief, a tapestry woven from countless tragedies and unfinished stories. One particularly bitter night, as a storm raged overhead and the wind shrieked through the pines, I decided to venture into the heart of the ridge. Clad in my thickest coat, I left the relative safety of the cabin and followed a narrow, overgrown path that led deep into the forest. The storm washed away the familiar trails, leaving only the raw, wild landscape a place where nature reigned supreme and the past clung desperately to every rock and tree. I reached a small, secluded glen where the trees formed a natural cathedral, their twisted branches arching overhead. In the center of the glen lay a pool of still water, its surface mirror smooth despite the raging storm above. I knelt beside the pool, the rhythmic tapping now replaced by a profound silence that felt heavier than any sound. As I gazed into the water, I began to see shapes beneath the surface flickers of movement, shadows that danced just out of reach. The images were fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet they filled me with an overwhelming sense of loss and longing. I spent hours there, lost in the trance of the glen, until exhaustion forced me back to the cabin. The encounter left me shaken and filled with questions. Were those reflections the restless souls of the ridge? Had Eleanor or others like her been calling out to me from the depths of the water? My journal entries became more desperate, filled with pleas to the unseen forces. Tell me your story. Release your sorrow. Let the echoes rest. The voice in my dreams grew louder, sometimes merging with the sound of the wind, sometimes with the gentle lapping of water against stone. I began to sense that I was no longer an observer, but a participant in a long-forgotten drama-living vessel through which the memories of Blackwater Ridge could speak. In the following weeks, the boundary between the living and the dead seemed to dissolve. I witnessed objects moving on their own, heard footsteps pacing the halls of the cabin when I was alone, and even caught a glimpse of a spectral figure standing on the ridge at dawn, a figure that vanished as soon as the light touched it. I found solace in the quiet desperation of the ridge, in the knowledge that I was uncovering truths that had been buried for generations. Yet, with each revelation, my own heart grew heavier, burdened by the sorrow of voices that would not rest. One night, as the storm subsided into a cold drizzle, I sat by the fire in the cabin and listened intently. The knocking returned now, a soft, persistent beat that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It was as though the ridge itself was speaking, calling out to me in a language older than time. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me, feeling a connection to something vast and ineffable. In that moment, I understood that Blackwater Ridge was not simply a place of tragic history, but a living, breathing entity, one that carried the weight of every lost soul, every broken dream, and every unanswered question. I realized that my presence here was no accident. I had been drawn to the ridge by forces beyond my understanding, to bear witness to its eternal lament. I now leave Blackwater Ridge with a heavy heart and a mind forever changed. The voices of the past still echo in my dreams, and the rhythmic knocking remains a reminder that some secrets are too profound to be forgotten. I write these words not as a final answer, but as an invitation to those brave enough to seek the truth in the quiet, haunted places of the world. For in the end, the ridge is a mirror to our own soulful reminder that the echoes of loss and longing persist long after the living have gone, and that sometimes, to understand the present, we must listen to the whispers of the past. Story 2. The Sorrow of Hollow Creek. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains lies a place known as Hollow Creek, narrow, winding valley where the mist clings to the ancient trees, and the creek flows with a quiet, unyielding persistence. It is said that Hollow Creek is cursed, that the sorrow of those who once lived there lingers in the water and the wind, whispering tales of loss and longing to any who dare listen. I had always been drawn to the mysterious allure of the Appalachians, and when I first heard the legends of Hollow Creek, I knew I had to see it for myself. I rented a small cabin on the edge of the valley, determined to uncover the secrets hidden within its dark, reflective waters. The journey to Hollow Creek was long and arduous, winding through dense forests and over rugged mountain passes. As I drove along the narrow roads, flanked by towering pines and craggy outcrops, I felt an almost tangible sense of isolation, the kind that presses in on you, makes you aware of every whisper of wind and every rustle in the undergrowth. The cabin itself was modest, its wooden exterior weathered by time and the relentless Appalachian weather. I arrived in the late afternoon, when the fading light bathed the landscape in a golden haze, and I set about unpacking my few belongings in a room that smelled of pine, earth, and old memories. That first evening, I stepped outside onto the creaking porch, gazing out over the valley as the sun dipped below the mountains. Hollow Creek wound its way through the darkness like a silver ribbon, reflecting the last glimmers of twilight. There was a profound stillness in the air, broken only by the gentle murmur of the water and the distant call of a whippoorwill. I felt a stirring in my heart, a mix of awe and a deep, unnameable sadness, as though the land were mourning a loss that had spanned centuries. In the days that followed, I explored the area with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. I followed the creek upstream, traversing narrow trails that led through dense thickets and over slippery rocks. Along the banks, I discovered old, weathered markers and broken relics of a bygone-era rusted tin box, a faded photograph of a family whose smiles had long since faded, and a small, intricately carved wooden cross. Each artifact seemed to carry a story, a whisper of sorrow that resonated with the mournful flow of the water. I began to document my findings in a leather-bound journal, my pen moving feverishly as I tried to capture every detail of the strange, spectral atmosphere that enveloped Hollow Creek. At night, the valley transformed. As darkness fell, the creek became a mirror of the sky, and the silence was punctuated by soft, echoing sounds of distant knocking, the creak of ancient trees swaying in the wind, and sometimes even a faint, sorrowful lullaby that seemed to rise from the water itself. One particularly cold night, as I lay in bed listening to the murmur of the creek through the thin walls of the cabin, I heard a sound that chilled me to the core, a rhythmic tapping coming from outside, near the water's edge. The sound was steady and deliberate, as if someone or something were knocking in time with the beating of a heart. I rose and wrapped myself in a thick blanket before venturing out into the night. The creek was shrouded in fog, the water barely visible beneath a cloak of mist. I followed the sound until I reached a small clearing where the trees opened up to reveal the creek's banks. There, illuminated by the pale light of the moon, I saw a figure standing at the water's edge. The figure was indistinct, more a shadow than a person, but its posture, and the way it seemed to reach out toward the water, sent a surge of dread through me. I called out softly, but the figure did not respond. It merely turned slowly, its head tilting as if in silent sorrow, before dissolving into the mist. Over the next several weeks, I became increasingly obsessed with the mystery of Hollow Creek. I scoured local archives and spoke with elderly residents, piecing together fragments of history that told of a tragedy, a family torn apart by despair, a young woman who had vanished without a trace, and the lingering curse that many believed had befallen the land. I learned of a woman named Lillian whose spirit was said to haunt the creek after she lost everything to a cruel twist of fate. According to local lore, Lillian had once been a beacon of hope, but grief had driven her to the water, where she would stand every night, waiting for something that would never come. My nights grew restless as I recorded the sounds of the valley, the rhythmic tapping near the water, the mournful echoes that seemed to whisper her name, and the occasional glimpse of a pale figure moving among the trees. The journal filled with desperate questions and feverish theories. Is Lillian's spirit trapped in the water? Do the echoes of Hollow Creek hold the key to a long-forgotten sorrow? I spent countless hours by the creek, hoping to capture the truth, even as an overwhelming sense of melancholy and dread settled over me. One evening, as a storm gathered strength and dark clouds obscured the moon, I found myself drawn to a narrow bridge that spanned the creek. The old wooden structure creaked under my weight as I crossed, each step echoing in the tempest. At the center of the bridge, I stopped and gazed down at the churning water. In that turbulent moment, the rhythmic tapping returned louder than ever before, accompanied by a low, almost inaudible murmur that sent shivers down my spine. I knelt by the railing, straining to make out the sound through the roar of the storm, and I could swear I heard a voice, soft and sorrowful, saying, "Remember me." The words were indistinct, yet filled with a profound longing that seemed to seep into my very soul. I spent the following night in the cabin, unable to sleep as the storm raged outside. In the flickering candlelight, I reviewed my journal and listened to the recorded sounds, each one a fragment of the haunting melody of Hollow Creek. I realized that the creek was not merely a geographic feature, but a repository of pain, a place where the voices of the lost echoed across time. And somewhere among those echoes, I felt, lay the truth of Lillian's fate and the curse that had enveloped this valley. When the storm finally subsided, and the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, I knew that I had reached a turning point. I left Hollow Creek with more questions than answers, but with a heart forever marked by the sorrow of that land. The memory of the spectral figure, the rhythmic tapping, and the mournful whispers remains etched in my Minda, constant reminder that some places harbor secrets too heavy for the living to bear. I now share this tale as a testament to the enduring power of grief and the relentless call of the pasta, warning to those who dare to wander too deeply into the heart of sorrow. Story 3. The Night the Shadow Spoke. Deep in the remote hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, where the nights stretch on endlessly and the darkness is as thick as velvet, there is a legend that few dare to speak of aloud. It is a tale of inexplicable encounters, of shadows that come alive with voices and shapes that defy human understanding. I first encountered this phenomenon on a night that began like any other, a cool, clear evening when the stars shone brightly above an ancient, slumbering landscape. I had taken a temporary job as a night watchman at an old textile mill, a derelict building that had once been the heartbeat of a small Appalachian town. The mill, abandoned for decades, stood as a crumbling monument to a bygone era, its walls whispering the secrets of countless lost souls. My shift began shortly after dusk. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight and a heavy-duty radio, I patrolled the darkened corridors and empty factory floors, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the vast, silent space. At first, everything seemed routine, just the creak of old metal, the rustle of wind through broken windows, and the occasional distant sound that could easily be attributed to the building settling. But as the night deepened, a sense of unease crept in, as if the very darkness were watching me. I began to notice strange, fleeting movement, shadows that darted from corner to corner, shapes that shifted at the edge of my vision. I tried to dismiss them as tricks of the light, the product of a fatigued mind and an overactive imagination. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing hour. In the dead of night, when the mill was shrouded in an almost oppressive silence, I heard something that would forever alter my perception of the world. It began as a low, almost imperceptible murmur, a whisper that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. I strained to listen, my heart pounding, as the murmur grew into a series of disjointed words, a litany of voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. "Come, stay, listen," they urged, the voices alternating between seductive and sorrowful tones. I froze, gripping my flashlight as if it were a talisman against the encroaching darkness. In that moment, the shadows around me began to shift more purposefully. I saw a shape take form, a vague, humanoid outline that moved slowly along the far wall, its features indistinct and ever-changing. The entity seemed to hover between reality and illusion, a living echo of the mill's forgotten past. Unable to tear my eyes away, I followed the shifting shadow down a narrow corridor. every step I took was accompanied by the soft murmur of voices, growing louder as if beckoning me to a hidden truth. The corridor ended at a heavy metal door, its surface rusted and scarred by time. The voices rose to a fevered pitch, and without knowing why, I felt compelled to push the door open. Beyond it lay a small, claustrophobic room that had once served as an office for the mill's foreman. Dust danced in the beam of my flashlight as I stepped inside, and on a battered desk sat an old ledger filled with handwritten accounts of the mill's operations, a record of long-forgotten workers and their toils. But what caught my attention was a single, faded photograph tucked between the Pagasa picture of a young man with an intensity in his eyes that seemed almost otherworldly. The back of the photograph was inscribed with a single word: abandoned. I felt a shiver run down my spine, as if the very word carried a curse. For the remainder of my shift, I found myself haunted by that image. I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched by something that had not been there before. In the ensuing nights, the phenomenon intensified. I began to hear clear, distinct voices in the silence, voices that recited fragments of poetry, old ballads of sorrow and despair, and even snippets of conversation that I could not place. I started to see faces in the broken glass of the old windows, faces that looked familiar, yet were distorted by an eerie quality that made them seem like twisted reflections of real people. One evening, as I patrolled near the mill's main entrance, I heard footsteps behind me, a deliberate, measured pace that matched my own. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there except for a lingering darkness that seemed to breathe. Then, from the depths of that darkness, I heard a voice whisper my name, soft and pleading, as if calling me to come closer. I began to document every detail in a journal, writing feverishly as the night unfolded with unexplainable events. My entries became a tapestry of terror and wonder, a record of shifting shadows, echoing voices, and a presence that defied explanation. I described the sensation of being enveloped by an unseen force, the way the darkness seemed to pulse with the memories of those who had vanished from the mill years ago. I recorded the times, the exact moments when the voices reached a crescendo, and the descriptions of the shapes that danced at the periphery of my vision. There were moments when I could have sworn that the mill's very walls were crying, that the sorrow of generations seeped through the cracks and into my very soul. One particularly harrowing night, as a bitter wind howled and the air turned frigid, the phenomenon reached its climax. I was in the central hall of the mill when the lights flickered violently, plunging the building into near darkness. In that moment, every voice, every whispered plea, converged into a single, overwhelming chorus that seemed to emanate from the very core of the building. I felt as though the shadows had grown thick enough to touch, as if I could reach out and grasp the intangible sorrow that filled the air. In the flicker of my failing flashlight, I saw the humanoid shape again, this time looming directly in front of me, its eyes blazing with an intensity that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. It raised its hand in what appeared to be a gesture of both invitation and warning, and in a voice that was a haunting echo of my own, it whispered, "We are the lost, and we have not forgotten." I stood there, paralyzed by fear and awe, as the entity slowly receded into the darkness, leaving behind an echo of despair that resonated in every corner of the mill. When the power finally returned and the lights steadied, the building was eerily silent, as if the voices had been sealed away once more. I left the mill at dawn, my mind forever scarred by the events of that night. Though I eventually resumed my work as a night watchman, the memories of those shadows and voices never left me. I would often find myself staring into reflective surfaces, half expecting to see that ghastly face staring back at me. The mill, abandoned and desolate, became a permanent scar on my soul, a reminder that in the darkest of nights, when the world falls silent, the echoes of the past are never truly gone. I share this account not as a challenge to belief, but as a testament to the mysteries that dwell in the forgotten corners of our world. The night the shadow spoke remains a haunting memory, a reminder that even in places where time seems to stand still, the voices of the lost continue to echo, waiting for someone brave enough to listen.